Good afternoon, and welcome to a conversation about the future of the Constitution. My name is Jay Swanson, and I'm a senior fellow at the Brennan Center, where I work on the Future of the Constitution project. The project is an initiative to provide a forum for experts, public figures, and the public to discuss the true meaning of the Constitution and the democratic principles embedded within it. Today's panel is part of that project, and I have the privilege of introducing the moderator, Kanawha County Commissioner and former West Virginia Secretary of State, Natalie Tennant. Natalie?
Thank you, Jay, and thank you to all of you for joining us. Well, should the United States Constitution be understood to guarantee a right to education? Seems like a simple question, right? But it is not as easily answered. That's why we're here today, as you heard Jay say. Welcome to the Brennan Center panel on education and the future of the Constitution. I'll be asking these questions and more as we discuss this with a stellar panel, including Becky Pringle, the national president of the NEA, that's the National Education Association. And we'll talk to Derek Black, who is chair in the constitutional law at the University of South Carolina Law School and directs the Constitutional Law Center there. And he has written extensively on this subject. But first, we're going to hear remarks from New Jersey Attorney General Matt Platkin, who has stood up and fought for the restoration of more than $158 million in federal education funding for New Jersey.
Thank you, Natalie, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Brennan Center and the National Education Association for inviting me to be a part of this important discussion. A healthy, well-functioning democracy relies on the active and informed participation of its citizenry. So it should come as no surprise that education plays a significant role in political and civic engagement in the United States. Given the critical role that education plays in our democracy, this panel discussion is timely because it invites all of us to imagine what it would mean if the United States Constitution was interpreted to recognize education as a fundamental right. In New Jersey, we've been on the forefront of efforts to ensure that all school-age children receive a quality education, and that is a right that's protected by our state's Constitution. In 1875, the people of New Jersey amended the Constitution of our state that would have been in effect at the time to require the legislature to, quote, provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of free public schools for the instruction of all children in the state. The current Constitution of New Jersey, which was adopted in 1947, carries through that language, mandating that the legislature provide for a, quote, thorough and efficient system of free public schools. New Jersey courts have since built upon this provision, as well as other constitutional provisions, through landmark cases. One groundbreaking example is the Abbott litigation brought in 1981 by school children from 4 of New Jersey's poorest school districts contesting the legislature's public school funding scheme. In the Abbott litigation, the New Jersey Supreme Court concluded, quote, the requirement of a thorough and efficient education means that poor, disadvantaged students must be given a chance to be able to compete with the relatively advantaged students. Here in New Jersey, we continue to have room for improvement in our public school system. Our system is not perfect, but the constitutional guarantee of a thorough and efficient education has been a success story. I'm so proud that New Jersey has the nation's best public school system and is consistently ranked as number 1 in the nation from pre-K to 12 and in education generally. I am a product of those schools. My kids are a product of those schools. Unfortunately, at the federal level, the Trump administration has done little to support our public education system and has done a whole lot to try to damage it. Indeed, they've launched a full-scale assault across the country on our system of public education as we know it. Just recently, they continue to make good on their cruel and reckless promise to dismantle the United States Department of Education. And they've frozen billions of federal funding for public schools that support students with learning disabilities, summer schools, and after-school programs. They've terminated programs that train teachers in underserved areas. And as you all know, they issued a Dear Colleague letter in February threatening to unlawfully pull all of the federal funding to our schools that seek to create inclusive learning environments that protect students from discrimination and harassment. Those attacks have had a deeply damaging effect on our public education system, particularly in our lower income communities. We've been successful in fighting back against these cuts. In fact, we were able to restore $158 million that the federal government froze for longstanding programs critical for our students here in New Jersey. Because of the Supreme Court's recent decision in the CASA case, however, we are only able to get relief for our coalition of states, not necessarily in states that do not join our litigation efforts. So when we win our cases against the administration to protect against funding cuts, but other states don't participate, the net effect is that the already significant national disparities in education will only grow worse. What we will see are deeper gaps between states in education quality and resources. These developments, the cutbacks, and the uneven way that they have been felt across the country only amplify the need for today's discussion on education as a federal constitutional right. It's my hope that New Jersey and other states can serve as a model for constitutional reform. Of course, that constitutional reform is not going to happen overnight, but it's important for us to be having these conversations now, thinking about how we want to shape our Constitution in the long term. We all should be fighting back against today's threats to our education system, and I know that so many of you are. But we should also be seizing the opportunity to reshape our system for the better going forward. And that's exactly what today's conversation is about. I want to thank you all for being here, and now I turn it back over to Natalie.
Thank you, Attorney General Platkin, for your work and your words. Now, let's turn to our panel. Becky and Derek, thank you again for joining us. And we're just going to get right into it. And either of you could start, but it is this question that seems easy, but it's time to get down to business. So should the Constitution be understood to guarantee a fundamental right to education? Why or why not?
Well, Natalie, speaking on behalf of educators, the answer is pretty simple. Maybe not easy to get to it, but it is pretty simple. The answer is absolutely yes. The NEA educators have long called for the federal government to own the role that it should play in public education. Our strategic vision and mission calls for us to unite not just our members, but the entire nation to reclaim public education as a common good, and to not stop there, that we have to actually transform it into a racially and socially and economically just and equitable system that prepares every student to succeed in a diverse and interdependent world. And so we've always been very clear that there is a role, certainly at the state level and at the local level, but the federal government has a role to play. And a guarantee of a public education for every single student, regardless of where they live, regardless of the state, regardless of their geography or zip code, should be codified in our U.S. Constitution. And I know we'll talk more about this later, how many of us interpret what's in there now to actually lay that foundation for us in a way that everything we do when we talk about public education in this country is it's absolutely foundational, that the U.S. Constitution supports that.
Very good. And you're right. We will get into that a little bit more and break that apart. But I do want to hear from Derek. What do you say about this? Why or why not should it be understood as a guarantee?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would break it into two pieces, and I agree with Becky on both pieces, but I just to break it apart. So there's the question of, does the federal government have a role in public education? And I don't have to say many words beyond Becky other than to say yes. The answer is yes. And the federal government has played that role for 2 centuries. So that's actually not new. It's played it at higher levels and lower levels, but it has been part of that project for a long time. The question of how we deal with that federal role, or whether students have an individual constitutional right to education, gets a little trickier. And I guess the simplest way to say it is, I do believe the federal Constitution does require states to provide public education to all students, right? But that's a little nuanced to say the federal Constitution requires states to provide public education to all students. And of course, as a result of that, all 50 state constitutions guarantee students access to public education. So clearly a federal role that overlays what it means to be a state, what it means to be a democratic state in the United States of America.
Is that you obviously do agree with that? He wanted to say yes, yes, yes to everything you said, Becky, and now that's pretty understandable and reasonable there, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I appreciate, Derek, that you pointed out, particularly these last 2 decades, but even longer than that, honestly, where we realized that the federal government had a role to play, a significant role to play, and it led to the passage of a lot of things, right? Including for us in education, a huge piece of what we're fighting for right now is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which really came out of the civil rights era, because we knew that we had more to do to guarantee the rights of every single American, and because education is fundamental in that, and we were very clear about the disparities, the inequities, honestly, that are built in every single social system in this country, which all of those social systems impact education, from housing to food insecurity. All of it impacts whether our kids come to school ready to learn. And so the foundational role that the federal government should play, should be understood to play, is that we have to ensure the right of every, and you'll hear me say that a lot, Natalie, every. And we know how important that is. We are, after all, the United States of America. Every child, whether they live in Mississippi or whether they live in Massachusetts, has a right to a high quality public education. And the federal government has a role to play, and it should be protected by the U.S. Constitution.
So when you talk like this, Becky, the Secretary of State in me can't help but see this parallel. You keep saying foundational, and there is this saying, and I know that both of you have heard it, that voting is the right that gives you all the other rights. And you're saying that about education too, that education for all, and we talk about in voting also, that it doesn't matter what your zip code is, you still deserve free, accessible, and fair elections. And you're saying that about it doesn't matter where you live, you still deserve that same education. And so I just can't help but see the parallel track, which then brings us to that connection. I mean, you just made it, and you made it as an educator. I made it as an election official, and even election official still as a county commissioner. But that connection between education and democracy, and maybe Derek, I'll let you start that. I mean, it gets me fired up just thinking about this, because I am from a family of educators, from a large family, and most of them are teachers. So I appreciate that. And the teacher was always right wherever I was. So Derek, go ahead, make that connection between education and democracy.
Yeah, well, I mean, it goes back to 1776, ironically enough, and for those counting dates, that's 11 years before the Constitution, and that's sort of significant because at that moment in time, the world is ruled by kings and queens, not regular people. Now, of course, by regular people at that point, they'd been talking about white male farmers, but even they had no real role in government. And so the concept at the beginning was, if we're going to do this radical thing and hand over political power to regular people, my goodness, they must be educated. They must understand what they're voting on. We must hope that they get to a point of understanding the common good, so they don't use political power just to take stuff from the elites. And so whether we're talking about Adams or Jefferson or Madison or Washington, all of those founders believed that our democratic system of government was predicated on educated populace, which is why the Northwest Ordinances of 1785 and 1787, which predate the United States Constitution, said that all of the territories outside of the colonies would be carved up into squares, and that every single square inch of towns would be carved up into 32 lots, and the 16th lot, the very center lot in every single town, would be reserved for public schools. And so that foundational structure for places that would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and all the way to the West Coast had public schools at their center. And Congress, time and time again, demanded that the state constitutions, as those territories became states, guarantee public education. So, yes, we have 50 state education clauses, but it's no accident that we have 50 state education clauses, because since 1776, 1785, Congress has demanded that of states. And, there's lots of other little nuances along the way, but we had that concept of democracy and education linked then. And I'll just quickly say, our democracy was far from perfect. Millions of people were enslaved. And so at the end of the Civil War, we once again restarted that conversation. And Congress said, you know what? You Southern colonies, you Southern states that weren't subject to the Northwest Ordinances, guess what? If you want to re-enter the Union, you must guarantee public education to all students, Black and white. And in fact, explicitly conditioned the readmission of some of those Southern states on them ensuring public education for all students.
Well, Becky, if you want to say something, I mean, add to that if you'd like.
So I appreciate that Derek is giving us a history lesson, which is always important. My dad taught history, and he was adamant about his girls learning history, their own family history, American history, which he's very clear about. That Black history, Native history, Latino history, all part of American history, and to learn world history. And one of the things that he told me as a child was that we should always follow the trajectory of a society, a government throughout history, throughout the world. And when the people that were in those positions of power started taking away the right for its citizens to learn, it became a flashpoint in that society. Because we understand that an educated citizenry is at the core of any democracy succeeding. We still are a pretty young democracy, and we have a lot of lessons yet to learn, and we have evidence of some of those lessons being learned. But for us to be a representative democracy, then the people that participate in that democracy have to have the education that I believe, certainly, and educators across this country believe, is foundational in our U.S. Constitution, and should be. And that the federal role has to be foundational rather than just thinking of it as supplemental. Codified in our Constitution and in democracies, honestly, around the world.
Can I add something there, Natalie?
Sure.
So there's another angle to this that Becky made me remember, and she was kind enough to endorse my book, Dangerous Learning, which actually predates, it tells a story of Black people's struggle for education prior to the Civil War. So there's another piece. We talked about voting and education's connection to voting, but forget about the ballot for a moment. Like, education itself is the pathway to freedom. And so what I tell the story of in Dangerous Learning was Black people in the South, both enslaved and free people of color, using education to make their way in life, using education to organize and resist, a government that didn't otherwise include them. And because of the power that education demonstrated, the South, starting in the 1820s and 1830s, went to war on Black literacy so as to prevent them from their ability to sort of leverage their place in the world. And when they got done with that, they began banning newspapers to ensure that white people didn't have the freedom to think otherwise as well. And so we also have this tension that education is actually the way to, or I said, the denial of education is the way that we repress democracy, unfortunately.
That was going to be my follow-up question to you when you talked about trying to make those improvements of the southern states, and they didn't have the Northeast agreement that you called. I mean, did they succeed in that? What happened with that?
Well, look, I think the answer is yes, they did in fact succeed incredibly. What happens is a later reversal. But if we're just talking about the South, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in Black Reconstruction that public education in the South is a Black idea. Now, that's quite startling to a lot of folks, but it was Black freedom and new Black citizens insisting on public education that forced it into these constitutions because they knew what it meant to freedom. They knew what it meant to democracy. And we did create a system of public education out of whole cloth and exponentially increase the number of Black and white children attending education in the South in just a few short years. I mean, it completely transforms the South. Now, most people don't know that story very well because Jim Crow comes along a decade and a half later to interrupt that democratic project. But I say it's still important because those education clauses actually lay dormant until the civil rights movement, when Thurgood Marshall came along and said, hey, education is the very foundation of citizenship. It is the primary function of state government. We may be separate in every other facet of life, but there is one place, only one place in America where we must enter through the door together. That's the schoolhouse. And that is actually the argument that Brown versus Board of Education bought. It didn't say segregation was unconstitutional in general. It said there's something special about the schoolhouse. There's something special about it in our constitutional system that makes segregation unconstitutional. And there's a lot of other history to sort of talk about as well after that. But yes, they accomplished something incredibly significant in the aftermath of the Civil War. And, Jim Crow tried to stamp it out, but enough of it survived to be revived by later generations.
But we still have to keep fighting for it, right, Becky? And
Mhm.
the Attorney General is of New Jersey is the example of that too. But we still have to keep fighting.
We do. And, there's so many things happening in 2025 that make us, as Derek took us through that history, uh, it reminds us that every generation has to fight. Every generation. This is still an experiment, this democracy. But for us as educators, it is so important that we do not undermine in this country a common understanding of what our democracy is, a common understanding of what it is. When people say our diversity is our strength, it's that beautiful tapestry that is this uniqueness of America. It's actually true, but that can only be true and get stronger if we have and share that common understanding of what a democracy is and how it works and who should fully participate in it. And you heard Derek go through those instances, and there's so many throughout our history where people were denied the right to participate, denied the right to learn to read. We know that is part of our history. And so the federal government's role that it ultimately took on in more modern times was absolutely critical to take us along our continued journey of fighting for the very foundation of our Constitution, that it's we the people, right? All of us have that right. For that to be true, we have to guarantee the education of everyone.
Well, looking back a little bit too, in 1973, 5 Supreme Court justices said that the Constitution does not protect the right to education, but 4 of them said that it did. So I guess the question was, I mean, who was right in that, even though it was a 5-4 decision? Derek, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't want to put anybody to sleep, so let me just preface it with that. But we really have to pull that case apart to say, well, what was the issue? And so,
Mhm.
what was being argued for was equal funding, sort of argument that equal funding violated a fundamental right to education. And, we could quibble back and forth about it, but the only thing the court rejected in San Antonio versus Rodriguez was the idea that the federal Constitution in and of itself demanded equal funding. And it said, look, this could have been a different case. The majority says this would be a different case if what we had here was an allegation that there was some absolute denial of education, or that there was some threshold of education that children needed that was being denied. But the plaintiffs in San Antonio versus Rodriguez had conceded, maybe that was a strategic mistake, but had conceded that all children were receiving at least some basic form of education. And so, it's an iconic case, but sometimes we read too much into it, because 10 years later, when we do have an absolute deprivation in the state of Texas, which is actually Texas denying education completely to undocumented students, the court actually strikes that down as a constitutional violation. And so the question that remains open, and the court has yet to answer, is there some minimal threshold of education that the Constitution does guarantee? And the court has left that question open on multiple times. It just hasn't had, a situation where it needed to answer it.
I would add, Natalie, that absolutely, and certainly disparity in funding from one district to another, sometimes a mile apart, is certainly unacceptable, and something that we should be able to guarantee through our Constitution. I would add that, so much of that decision too was steeped in that whole concept of local control, which certainly at the time, and still today for sure, has a resonance in different ways for different people, groups of people, as you talk about it. But we know that what we know from history is that local control is what enabled and empowered local school authorities to engage in this massive resistance, right, to Brown, in trying to prevent school integration. And so when concerns about infringing on local control are brought up, we know that from history that there should be a role to play to ensure that when the Supreme Court decision, Brown decision, that separate separate is inherently unequal, that everything beyond that, and even today, as we think about what we need, next steps we need to take, it is really important to understand that the role of the federal government should be to ensure equity and access and opportunity for everyone.
Well, that brings up a point. We talk about San Antonio against versus Rodriguez, 1973, and here we are in 2025, and that's about funding. Well, I can give an example of West Virginia. We now have a Hope Scholarship that money goes to anyone who wants to homeschool, or folks who want to send their children to private education. At the same time, then, obviously, that's taking money from the public schools, and there are so many public schools now being consolidated. Like, are we seeing that 1973 all over again, in a sense? I'm sure that West Virginia is not alone in that, but it is certainly hurting public education. And they'll say, "Oh, it's just the population that West Virginia is losing." No, we're closing schools, and there's not enough funding now to keep schools open. What do you think about that? So,
Well, as I
and
said at the outset, public education is the foundation of a democracy. And that is what the federal government should be focused on, is public education, not private education, not vouchers or voucher schemes designed to take away funding and support from our public schools, because our public schools are designed to accept all of our students, all of them, and not discriminate against them. They don't get they don't have the right, and hesitating to use that word, that private schools have to deny students or to send them back to public schools if they are too costly to educate. No, public schools accept everyone. And certainly, Natalie, absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's not just West Virginia; it's throughout the country, and it's one of the things that we, the NEA, will continue to fight this current administration on, is the federal vouchers, because we've already have the evidence. We've seen it. You just described it. When we had statewide voucher systems that took money out of public schools and closed those public schools, and then we had students in rural areas, students with disabilities that didn't have access and the funding they needed. It's absolutely essential that we understand the damage that will do to our democracy. And, if you want to ask me, do I think it's deliberate? I do. I think it's deliberate.
Well, I mean, and that just, and you kind of said it when you said that public schools don't have the right to, or maybe vice versa, private schools have the right to deny someone, and transparency. My daughter went to a Catholic school. However, public education, I don't need to get on my soapbox for it. But do you think then that private education advances democracy in the same that public would? I mean, you kind of even said it just in a brief description. I mean,
Well, and I,
as we talk about
yeah,
education, democracy, and the Constitution.
I'll answer that quickly because I'd like to hear what he's thinking too. I said this before, that with public education, part of our mission is to have a common understanding of what democracy is, and what it means to all of us. And that's not the mission of most private schools, and they have a right to have their mission, but that's not it. So the institution of public education is the cornerstone of a democratic society, because it's opposed to, that's part of its mission, provide all students with a common understanding of what their roles and responsibilities are in society. And undermining that common understanding, and not even in suggesting that private schools do that in a deliberate way. They just have a different mission, and they certainly have a right to exist, and parents have the right to make that choice. But for the federal government, its role and responsibility is ensuring all, and that is public education.
Right. All right, Derek, she wants to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've had folks on the other side of this issue, I think, muddling things a bit. So I have no objection to the existence of private schools. I have no objection to them teaching whatever it is they want. The Constitution also guarantees parents the right to control the upbringing of their children, sort of freedom of thought, et cetera, et cetera. So no problem with it. But that question is different from the question of whether taxpayers should be footing the bill for that private education. And, I'm a broken record on this, but let's rewind back to, 1865, 67, 68. All of these states, they actually foresaw, November 20th, 2025. And they knew there would be a day when private entities would come for the public education dollar. They knew that it was inconsistent with public government for the reasons Becky described. And they also understood that for the public schools to lose those vital resources, to divide those vital resources, would put the overall public education project in danger. So what did those states do? They actually specifically wrote into their constitution that public education dollars, or public dollars, shall not be used for those private schools. They also did lots of other things and said the common school funds shall be used only for common schools, right? So they saw this problem and tried to cut it off. And look, the first time this issue came to the Florida Supreme Court said, this was in 2003 or so, said simple answer here. Constitution says no, so you can't have your vouchers, right? And we've had a lot of other cases go that way as well. Credit to NEA and Becky's support. They're out there and their legal team, partnering with various others to fight these cases, and we've won several of them. But the problem is what I would call undemocratic legislators who do not care what the Constitution says. And so they try to create these schemes. They try to create these diversions. They try to create these loopholes to try to do it anyway. It's because they're just sort of, well, I guess, hell bent on using public dollars for private education. So again, the problem isn't private schools. The problem isn't, parents' choice. The problem is using public school dollars, public tax dollars to fund that system. And when the public does that, you really have to question its motives, because vouchers came into existence as a way to resist Brown versus Board of Education. The state of Virginia, in the aftermath of Brown, said, we are going to authorize every public school in this state to close and use those dollars on private schools so that we can maintain segregation. Now, fortunately, the Supreme Court said that purpose is actually also unconstitutional under the federal Constitution as well.
You are going through what West Virginia did go through over the last 5 years. The same with the lawmakers, legislature, developing the Hope Scholarship, being sued. Circuit Court said, no, you can't use public dollars. The Supreme Court of West Virginia overturns it and allows it to happen. So yeah, I mean, folks should look at their own states and see what's happening there.
Well, I mean,
So
because that's crucially, but now, I mean, I hate to pick on your state, but I'm very familiar with that case, and it's not unique. I mean, I do think, since we're at the Brennan Center, I think that, our judges really need to think seriously about this broader constitutional history, why these clauses came into our Constitution. And I think that sometimes, not being steeped in the history and these constitutional issues, they think this is a policy skirmish between the NEA and the state. And who are they to say otherwise? But I think if folks can take anything away from this conversation, this isn't a policy skirmish, but rather this is a fundamental aspect of our constitutional history. And I just hope that would steel more state Supreme Court justices to not be unduly deferential to legislators.
And Natalie, I know we're talking about a different branch of government in this conversation.
no, sorry about that.
But I must add that you would hope that, in the judicial branch, they're watching what voters are saying. Voters soundly reject it when they get the chance to vote on it. They do, because they love they want their public school. They're not denying access for parents like you to make those choices, but they want their public dollars going to public schools, even parents who put their children in private schools, because they understand their child's not going to be successful if the child a mile away is not being successful. We are a democracy. All we need for our country to be successful, for your child to be successful, my child needs to be successful. And so the voters have been very clear. No, do not take public funds from our public schools. Now, the elected leaders, that's another thing.
Right. Sometimes they're not listening to their folks. Yeah, West Virginia is a story, that's for sure. So let's just go on with continuing this and say that the Constitution was understood to protect the right to education. Wouldn't that put the courts just back in charge of our education system? Would that be a good outcome if we understood it like that?
Well, we're pausing. I'll jump in. They'll edit it. So I don't think it's a good idea to put courts in charge of our schools. So I don't think anyone's advocating for that. I mean, what the Constitution does is set a floor, right? And we've seen this in state constitutional litigation as well, which is, the courts don't dictate what's going to happen in the schools. They simply say, has the state lived up to the constitutional floor? And if they haven't, they say, state, go try again. They don't rewrite the law. So, I mean, ultimately, the way a fundamental right to education operates is to just operate as a check on the political process. It doesn't dictate, right, what's going to be taught in first period or second period, or, who's the teacher or not the teacher. But it says, look, there's some floors below you will not fall. And so, yeah, I don't think we've seen that as a problem. And ultimately, sometimes what those courts really do, to give credit to them, is to give legislators cover Some of them just don't want to stand up and do their constitutional job, but then they'll say, "Oh, woe is me. The court has said we've failed." So, it actually kind of bucks them up sometimes to go, "Okay, let me do my job. Let me fund education properly."
I could not agree more. It's not saying that they will be in charge of, that's one of the,
Mm.
I think, ruses that so many try to use when we talk about the role of the federal government in education. Its role should be to guarantee access and equity and opportunity for all of our students. It's not to act as a school board um, uh, uh, in the ways that those elected leaders are charged with acting, but it does mean that they should absolutely work to guarantee that every single part of this puzzle, local, state, and national, is doing everything they possibly can to ensure that access, equity, and opportunity.
Well, I might add to that. I mean, I will say, and welcome Becky to disagree with me on this. I mean, I do think we have had mission creep. I'll be honest. I try to call it straight. I think we've had mission creep at times out of the U.S. Department of Education. Not necessarily for bad reasons. Sometimes it's for sort of well-meaning reasons. But I think it's also important that the federal government stay in its lane, right? Because part of what I fear that we have done through mission creep over the last 10 or 15 years is that it's kind of forgot about its core job, right? It's sort of taken on worrying about too many other issues that really aren't necessarily, any of its business, to be quite honest. And so, I think it's unfortunately become a little bit less concerned with equal access to resources, a little bit less concerned with resolving discrimination claims, and more worried about whether we're going to have a teaching evaluation system based upon standardized test scores or surveys, which just doesn't seem like the thing that the federal government ought to be involved in from my perspective.
I must say this, Natalie. I completely agree with what Derek just said. Completely.
So how do we find that balance then that he's talking about? I mean, if states, there are some states, we just given an example, um, that it might not be enough that states individually are guaranteeing the right to education, and we also want the not support, but we want that support, for lack of a better word, from the federal government. So how do we find that balance? Because I mean, that's why we're here right now, isn't it? We don't have that balance. We are concerned and worried here.
So yes, there is resetting that we must do, but diminishing, demolishing, what's the word, other D word, dismantling the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education is not the way to go. I had the opportunity to hear from a student who participated or helped to lift up a case from her school district where it was a white student who wanted to be a part of shedding light on the fact that the Black students in her school were not being given equal opportunity. And so a group of parents and students brought that case to the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education. And it was in the throes of going through that process where the Department of Education then would review it, would investigate, and then would say to the school district what remedies they believe they should employ when this administration came in and fired the people that were working on that very case. And that's just one case, but that is an appropriate role for the federal government to play, and so the Office of Civil Rights is an example of where we think about how we reset where we have been for the last decade and a half, or maybe longer, really longer, actually, but really steeped in the last decade and a half. Focusing on equity, access, and opportunity, and the starting with that very basic, you know, access for every student, no matter where they live, and the resources to have a high quality education.
Yeah. What do you think, Derek? Is there a balance? Because I'm going to follow up with hers. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we look at historically what has been the most central core mission of the federal government, it has been racial equality, right? It's the outgrowth of Brown versus Board of Education. And then from that grew sex equality and disability equality and English language learner equality. So if we were to define the core aspect, it is to prevent discrimination against disadvantaged students in public education. That emanates not just from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, but from the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution as well. And that's the part that right now we are seeing dismantled through policy. And so that is an extreme misbalancing. And then I think the question is, okay, once we have that core piece, what additional things are appropriate for the federal government? And I actually think, that's where I think of the supportive role, right? That the federal government ought to be helping schools and students and states who can't help themselves. So if we look at the now I'm going to risk putting people to sleep, but if we look at Title I dollars, just very quickly, right? When we first passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, almost all those Title I dollars went to Mississippi and Alabama and sort of the poorest of the poor in the country and creating leverage for desegregation. I had to be honest, Title I is effectively an entitlement program today where every single school and every single state gets the money. I mean, maybe I don't object to that, but I have to be honest, what I do object to is the fact that Mississippi gets more per pupil. I should say Massachusetts gets more money per pupil than Mississippi. That doesn't make any sense to me in terms of equity, particularly given the financial capacity of Massachusetts versus Mississippi. And you say, well, why are they doing that? Well, the reason why we're doing that is to create leverage to demand that every school in every state adopt an accountability system or a testing system that matches up with federal objectives. And that's where I think we get into a little bit of mission creep. Why don't we finish the job of making sure that every student has what they need? And that means concentrating on the neediest students and the neediest states. But I also understand Congress has to make sausage, and so we get mission creep and loss of core mission with big bills like ESEA. And so, to a certain extent, we tolerate that. But I really think we've fallen down on our core job far too often.
Do you think you talked about this, Becky, the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education? And I'll be honest, I didn't know. I didn't go into the family business of being a teacher or an educator, so I didn't know what it did. And then you explained it so well. Is this part of the problem that the public doesn't really know what has taken place with, we think, oh, they cut education funding. Well, that's okay. The state should be doing it, or there's too much bureaucracy in federal government. And so we as the general public don't understand it.
That is absolutely true, Natalie, and that is absolutely an issue. And as educators, one of the things that we realize, and I don't want to say it in a way that we didn't always know this, but certainly right now, we realize how important our voice is in educating not just our students, but the general population. And as this fight came right to our doors, and we as educators, we knew, so we were alarmed right from the beginning, that the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and notwithstanding what Derek has said, I completely agree, mission creep and all of that. But the fact that the reality for us as educators, that we weren't going to get the support, that the parents weren't going to get the support, that we weren't going to continue to move toward a more inclusive education system for students with disabilities it's alarming for us. And even and though we talk a lot about the funding, and that is absolutely critical, it is also important that the federal government sets a tone at the top.
Mhm.
And I don't want to say they're the top. I don't want to say it that way, but they should absolutely be supporting our communities, our parents, our educators and students, and always trying to do better as we learn more about how we educate our students with disabilities, and I'm just using that as one example, but our students with disabilities, gathering that information together so that we can do a better job. And it's absolutely essential for us. And so we right away knew that to be true. But we have to do a better job of explaining that. And we have to do a better job of what Derek said before, that when we talk about things like Title I that people, glaze over, we have to be able to explain it, and we have to be willing to make the changes we need to ensure that those students that have the greatest needs, those needs are being met.
Yeah, let me add, because Becky keeps reminding me of good ideas I once had, and now I remember them. But, there's something very special about the Office for Civil Rights that I think regular folks don't fully understand. Like, most of what happens in America is a pay-to-play system. If you can pay, you can play. If you can't pay, sorry, right? And even with our civil rights, to a certain extent, it is a pay-to-play system, because you know what? You got to hire an attorney, you got to go into court, and if you win, yeah, you can get your attorney's fees back, but if you don't win, out of luck. That's what makes the Office of Civil Rights so special for the last half century, because it is predicated on the idea that children's right to be free from discrimination in public schools should not depend on their wealth. It shouldn't depend upon whether they can afford an attorney. And so right now, as we're speaking, you can go to the Office of Civil Rights website and file a complaint. Take you about 5 or 10 minutes to talk about discrimination. Don't have to have an attorney. Don't have to. And this Office of Civil Rights will come out and investigate it and hopefully vindicate your rights. I should say 12 months ago, that would have been the case. But when we fire over half of the attorneys, when we close the office in Cleveland, when we close 6 or 7 other offices for civil rights, we now double the travel time for investigators and fire half of the investigators. We now live in a world that, for the most part, children's right to be free from discrimination is now a pay-to-play system, because we are dismantling the Office for Civil Rights. That's what people need to understand about what's been happening at the Department of Education.
Good points, good thoughts. And I would ask, well, what can we all do about this? But that's what you two are especially doing by Derek, all the writings that you're doing, all of the amicus briefs that you're getting involved in, whether it's West Virginia or any other state, and Becky, to continue to work with state lawmakers or state officials, like in New Jersey with the Attorney General, to get that money back that was afforded to the children of New Jersey. So as we wrap up, how about, if you want to have 30 seconds of a wrap up, let's hear what you want to wrap up with a final thought. Go ahead, Becky.
So first of all, I want to start where you ended, and that is just a huge thank you to the attorneys generals around the country who have been standing up and fighting for the rights of all of us, honestly. And I'm going to end with this. Derek, you put this in my head when you talked about W.E.B. Du Bois earlier. And his words in this conversation just resonate with me when he said that of all the civil rights for which this world has fought and died for 5,000 years, the right to learn is the most fundamental. The freedom to learn has been bought by bitter sacrifice. So whatever we might think about the curtailment of other civil rights, we must fight to the last ditch to keep open the right to learn. That is the very foundation of what we're talking about. And it is the right to learn for every student. And the federal government has a huge foundational role to play, that if we say every, we actually mean every. Access, equity, opportunity for all of our students.
Well, I don't know that I want to go last, because I don't want to follow that. I should have jumped in there. But I'll just quickly say that We've taken a lot for granted over the last few decades, right? We've taken for granted the idea that the federal government would support our students, that it would be there in the breach, that our public officials at the state and federal level would act consistent with statutes and the Constitution. And because of that, well, I should say, and our public education project has been bipartisan for decades and decades. And sadly, that bipartisanship is falling apart.
Mm.
And as it falls apart, or as we lose support, I really do think that regular folks have to now hold their public officials accountable for what they are doing or not doing in public education in a way that they didn't used to have to do. And that's sad, right? It's sad that now public education has become an issue that we are fighting about. But anyway, I think we have to expect more of government than what it's been doing as of late, and that is unfortunately a marker of a democracy in dire straits. But part of getting that democracy back on the right course is to make sure that its fourth pillar, right, first pillar being the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, that the fourth pillar of government, public education, is as sound as those first three.
Mhm.
Very good. And we'll be looking at you two and others for your vision and your leadership on this. And I want to say thank you for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in and coming to this Brennan Center panel on education and the future of the Constitution. Look for more panels like this. Again, thank you for joining us.